What if the place you call a refuge was only waiting for the right moment to close its doors? What if the love that looks like care were in fact a silent agreement you accepted without reading the fine print? What if the embrace that surrounds you were also the exact gesture that prevents your steps from moving forward? Some questions don't arise from curiosity, but from survival. They appear when something inside us begins to realize that comfort is not the same as safety, and that too much silence can be just as dangerous as chaos. There are questions that don't ask for immediate answers. They simply settle in, like a discreet crack, waiting for the right moment to widen. What if memory didn't live only in the mind, but were embedded in places? What if walls could remember better than people? What if destiny had a fixed address, and you were invited to live there? Some houses are not built to shelter, they are built to remain. They learn the rhythm of those who enter, memorize footsteps, observe habits, and little by little begin to decide what can or cannot happen inside them, not out of malice, not out of human intention, but because over time they have learned that to exist requires possession. Love, when it encounters a place like this, is often mistaken for salvation, because love also promises permanence. It promises to stay. It promises not to leave. And when two forces that hate abandonment meet, something inevitably closes. She didn't know that yet. At that moment, she believed only that she was tired. Tired of noisy streets, of repetitive days, of relationships that demanded too much and offered too little. She believed she was heading toward a new beginning, toward a man who seemed solid, toward a place that promised enough silence for her to finally hear her own breathing. She didn't realize that she wasn't choosing the destination. The destination had already chosen. The road was long and narrow, lined with ancient trees that seemed to grow inward, as if trying to block any attempt to return. The sky was too clear for the weight that was beginning to form in her chest, and that bothered her in a way she couldn't explain. Sometimes, excessive calm is just the last disguise before change. As the car moved forward, the phone signal disappeared. First the notifications, then the network. Finally, the very sensation of being connected to anything other than that road. She noticed, but she didn't turn back. She had gone too far to pretend this wasn't what she wanted. When the house appeared among the trees, there was no shock. There was recognition. The building wasn't grand, nor threatening at first glance. It was old, yes, but maintained with a care that felt more like devotion than upkeep. The dark facade absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. The tall windows observed the surroundings with an almost organic patience. There were no bars, no visible fences. Still, something there said that this space had very clear limits. She parked and turned off the car. The silence that formed was immediate and deep, as if the world had been put on pause. No insects, no birds, no noticeable wind, just the house, waiting. Her name was Helena. Helena took a deep breath before getting out of the car. The air smelled different. Damp earth, old wood, something metallic hidden beneath it all, like rain about to fall on iron. The kind of smell you don't forget once you recognize it. Each step toward the front door seemed to strip something away from her. A sense of urgency, a defense, a part of her life that stayed behind without ceremony. Before she could knock, the door opened, not abruptly, not slowly, at the exact time it seemed to have been calculated. And there he was, with a restrained smile, a gaze that mixed firmness and warmth, and a presence that seemed to occupy more space than his body. He, the one Helena believed to be the answer. The protection. The reason all of this would finally make sense, she didn't notice, but the house did. That in that instant something aligned definitively, because the first step inside is never just a step. It is consent. And as Helena crossed the threshold believing she was entering a home, the walls, silent and attentive, finally recognized what they had been waiting for so long, someone willing to stay. And so, without locks snapping shut, without clear warnings, without any visible violence, the story began to seal itself. The door closed behind Helena with a low, deep sound, almost respectful. There was no slam, no impact. It was the kind of closing that doesn't demand attention but makes itself remembered later. Helena didn't turn to look, not yet. She was too busy trying to understand the sudden density in the air, as if she had crossed an invisible border where the world breathed differently. The interior of the house was larger than the facade suggested. The ceiling in the hall rose too high, creating a sense of smallness that wasn't uncomfortable, but certainly wasn't accidental. Light filtered in through tall windows, broken into soft tones that didn't fully illuminate, only revealed enough to guide footsteps. The wooden floor creaked irregularly, as if certain boards were more awake than others. Helena felt the urge to say something, anything to break that thick silence, but gave up. There was a kind of quiet there that didn't seem to like being interrupted. The man in front of her stepped back a few paces, allowing her to enter fully. His name was Kaio. Helena had known that for months, since their first long, careful conversations, in which he always seemed to listen more than he spoke. Kaio had a way of being that conveyed stability, economical movements, firm posture, an attentive gaze without being invasive. It was easy to associate him with the idea of protection. Too easy. He moved through the house like someone who knew not only the spaces, but their moods. He passed certain points more quickly, others more slowly. He didn't touch the walls unnecessarily. He didn't open windows more than required. The house seemed to accept his presence without resistance, like a body recognizing an old habit. Helena was led into the main living room, a wide space with heavy old furniture arranged with almost ceremonial symmetry. A wall clock marked the hours with a deep grave ticking that didn't seem to measure time, but to assert it. There were old paintings on the walls, landscapes, portraits, domestic scenes, all in darkened tones as if the light had been slowly drained from them. Helena sat on the sofa Kaio indicated. The upholstery yielded in an oddly comfortable way, wrapping around her more than supporting her. For a second she thought that this was exactly the kind of comfort she had searched for so long, something that would hold her when exhaustion finally allowed itself to exist. Kaio sat across from her, not beside her. That caught her attention, though she couldn't say why. There was a kind of respectful distance there, almost ritualistic. He spoke about the house naturally, mentioning its age, its vague history, the constant care it required. He spoke as one would describe someone dear but demanding. Helena watched him as he spoke, noticing small details that would have escaped her before, the way he paused before mentioning certain rooms, how he looked away when speaking about the upper floor, how he used the word stay more often than live. Even so, she felt an unexpected tenderness grow inside her, not for the place, but for him. Kaio seemed like someone who had learned to offer safety because he deeply understood its absence, and that created a silent bond between them, a kind of unspoken agreement of mutual care. When he stood up to get something to drink, Helena was left alone for a few minutes. That was when she realized the sound of the clock had stopped. The ticking was gone. She looked up at the clock on the wall. The hands were still moving, but silently. Helena frowned, a light shiver running along her arms. It wasn't fear, it was strangeness. The kind of detail the brain tries to ignore to preserve a sense of normality. Kaio returned, placing a glass in her hands. The water was too cold, almost icy, and as she drank, Helena felt a brief discomfort in her chest as if her body had reacted before her mind. The clock began ticking again immediately after the first sip. Helena smiled, embarrassed with herself. She was tired, that was all. The trip, the move, the expectation. It was natural to notice too much. Kaio led her to the room that would be hers. The bedroom was on the first floor, in a quieter wing of the house. It was spacious, with a large bed, an old dresser, a window facing the side garden. There were dried flowers in a vase on the nightstand. They didn't seem decorative, they seemed preserved. Helena ran her fingers over the sheets, feeling the firm, heavy fabric. Everything there seemed made to last, to resist time, to not be easily replaced. When Kaio said goodnight, leaving her alone to rest, Helena walked slowly around the room. She opened her suitcase, took out only a few things. She didn't feel rushed. The house seemed to induce a slower, almost drowsy rhythm. When she opened the window, she felt the air change. The garden was wide, surrounded by tall trees that cast long shadows even though the sun was still up. There was no visible fence marking the property, but Helena had a clear sensation that the space had a very well-defined end. As she closed the window, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten slightly. The inside doorknob had a small built-in locking mechanism, nothing unusual, nothing suspicious on its own. Still, Helena didn't remember seeing it before. She touched the lock, just out of curiosity. It didn't turn. That night, as she lay down on a bed far too large for someone who had arrived alone, Helena felt the house settle around her, not with hostility, with attention, as if it were learning the exact weight of her presence. And before falling asleep, a thought crossed her mind with uncomfortable clarity. She didn't feel like she was sleeping in a house, but inside something, and as sleep carried her away, the mansion silently learned the sound of Helena's breathing, a small detail but essential for everything that would come next. Helena woke without knowing exactly why. There was no noise, no abrupt dream, no sensation of falling. She simply opened her eyes, as if something had decided rest was enough. The room was still wrapped in a bluish dimness, that undefined color that comes before dawn. For a few seconds, Helena didn't remember where she was. Then the house imposed itself on her memory with unsettling naturalness. She took a deep breath. The air felt colder than the night before, denser too, as if it had been kept there, without circulation, simply waiting for someone to use it. As she moved in the bed, she felt the mattress give unevenly, as if it had been used more frequently than she had imagined. It wasn't a logical thought, but a bodily sensation, hard to translate into words. She got up slowly and walked to the window. The garden was covered in a light mist, and the trees seemed closer than the day before, as if they had taken a few steps forward during the night. Helena frowned, trying to remember if that made sense. Her mind searched for ordinary explanations, change of perspective, different light, fatigue. She accepted them all without much resistance. As she stepped out of the bedroom, she realized the house was already awake, not in a human sense, but in something more subtle. The floor creaked at specific points, even when no one was stepping on it. The clock in the living room marked the hours with the same deep ticking, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Helena had the strange impression that, while she slept, the space itself had remained active. Kaya was waiting for her in the kitchen. The room was spacious and old, with dark wooden cabinets and a large central table marked by scratches and stains that seemed to tell stories of their own. Light came in through a tall window, but never fully reached the corners. There were always areas left in shadow, as if the house preferred not to reveal everything at once. Kaya prepared coffee with precise, almost automatic movements. He greeted her with a discreet smile, without surprise, as if he knew exactly when she would wake up. Helena only realized that later, but the details stayed with her. They sat at the table, facing each other. The coffee was hot, strong, comforting. Helena felt her body respond positively, as if that simple gesture confirmed she had made the right choice in coming. Kaya spoke little, but when he did, it was always with careful, almost therapeutic attention. He asked about the trip, the fatigue, how she had felt during her first night. Helena answered with measured honesty. She spoke of the silence, the rest, the sense of slowing down. She avoided mentioning the diffuse discomfort, the strangeness that still had no clear shape. Kaya seemed satisfied with that. There was a contained approval in his gaze, as if each answer were a silent test being passed. After coffee, he suggested they walk around the property. He said the day was pleasant, that the fresh air would help Helena feel more at ease. She agreed. She wanted to see how far that space extended, this place that was already beginning to present itself as an entire world. The walk was slow. Kaya guided the path without seeming to guide it. He never said this way or that way, but Helena noticed that her steps naturally followed his. The terrain was uneven, but not difficult. There were discrete paths, almost invisible, as if the ground itself had learned where it was allowed to be stepped on. Helena noticed that, although the land was wide, they never strayed too far from the house. Whenever it seemed they might circle a more distant cluster of trees, Kaya subtly changed direction. It wasn't obvious enough to feel like control. It was simply guidance. She felt a slight discomfort as she noticed this, but dismissed it again. Maybe he knew the land better. Maybe there were dangerous areas. Maybe he was just being careful. Love often wears the clothes of care with ease. When they returned, Helena felt a strange exhaustion, not physical, but mental, as if each step had required more attention than it should have. The house received them with the same concentrated quiet as the day before. As she crossed the doorway, Helena had the clear sensation that the interior was warmer than the outside, though the weather didn't justify such a difference. The following days fell into a pattern that established itself far too quickly. Waking up, coffee together, small tasks around the house, short walks, meals at fixed times, long, deep conversations always revolving around permanence, stability, and how the outside world seemed increasingly fragile and unpredictable. Kaya spoke of this with calm conviction, and Helena found herself agreeing, not because she had once thought otherwise, but because there, everything seemed to make sense. The romance grew without explosions. It was a slow, almost silent growth, like roots spreading beneath the soil. Helena felt seen, welcomed, needed. Kaya seemed to find in her a presence that justified the constant effort of keeping that place alive. But there were details. There always were. Helena began to notice that some rooms remained permanently closed, doors that were never opened, not even for cleaning. Kaya naturally avoided these spaces, as if they belonged to a forbidden geography that required no explanation. When Helena asked, he answered with gentle evasions, old things, unused spaces, parts of the house that weren't worth it. At night, Helena heard sounds coming from the upper floor. Not clear footsteps, but something between movement and a soft dragging. When she mentioned it, Kaya attributed it to the old structure of the house, to temperature changes, to the wind. He spoke with such naturalness that Helena almost felt embarrassed for questioning it. Still, something inside her remained alert. One afternoon, alone in the living room, Helena studied the paintings more carefully. One of them caught her attention insistently, the portrait of a young woman, simply dressed, with a gaze far too serious for her age. There was something about her that reminded Helena of herself, not physically, but in the restrained expression, in the way she seemed to exist without taking up too much space. Helena stepped closer, a faint shiver running through her. There was no nameplate, just the portrait. Looking more closely, she noticed a detail that made her heart race. Around the woman's neck, almost hidden by the collar of the dress, there was a simple, dark necklace, like a thread of shadow. Helena instinctively raised her hand to her own neck. She wasn't wearing any necklace. Still, she felt the weight of something that wasn't there. At that moment, she heard Kaio call her from the kitchen. His voice sounded too close, as if he had known exactly where she was and what she was looking at. Helena stepped away from the painting quickly, trying to ignore the growing sensation that it wasn't merely decoration. That night, when she lay down, Helena took a long time to fall asleep. The room felt smaller, the walls closer, the silence more attentive. She had the clear impression that if she spoke out loud, it wouldn't be only Kaio who would hear her. Before closing her eyes, a thought formed with disturbing clarity. The love she was building there didn't ask only for presence, it asked for adaptation, and the house seemed to learn day by day how much Helena was willing to mold herself. Without realizing it, she no longer wondered when she would leave, only when she would wake up the next day. Helena woke with the uncomfortable sensation that she had been watched while she slept. It wasn't sudden paranoia, nor explicit fear. It was something quieter and more persistent, like a bodily memory that refused to dissolve. The room was exactly as she had left it the night before. Nothing had been moved, nothing seemed out of place. And yet, there was a difference hard to define, as if the space had been subtly rearranged to accommodate her better. She sat on the bed and noticed the wall clock wasn't showing the correct time. It was slow, not by minutes but by hours. Helena frowned, trying to remember if she had said it before going to sleep. She couldn't remember. The idea that perhaps she had never remembered began to trouble her more than it should have. When she left the room, she found Kaio in the hallway, standing in front of one of the always closed doors. He didn't seem to notice her at first. He was motionless, one hand resting against the wood, as if listening to something on the other side. When he finally turned, his face showed a brief trace of surprise, too quick to be accidental, too slow to be spontaneous. He smiled soon after, with the calm that had become familiar, and made a trivial comment about the day, as if he hadn't been standing there for an undefined length of time. Helena replied, but the discomfort settled in for good. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt the urge to leave without telling anyone. In the kitchen, while they prepared coffee, Helena mentioned that she might go into town later, just to walk around a bit, buy something simple, feel the movement of people. Kaio didn't react immediately. He kept stirring the coffee with excessive care, mentally counting each turn of the spoon, as if he needed to organize something before responding. When he spoke, his voice was too gentle. He said it might be better another day. He mentioned unstable weather, the slippery road, how Helena was still adapting. Nothing sounded like a prohibition. Everything sounded like protection. Still, Helena felt a strange tightness in her chest, as if a decision had been taken away from her before it had even been made. She insisted lightly, almost joking. She said she needed a different kind of air. Kaio smiled again, but this time the smile didn't reach his eyes. He agreed, in the end, said he would go with her. Helena felt a stab of frustration she couldn't justify. She didn't want company, she just wanted to go. The realization surprised her. They left together. The day was overcast, the sky heavy, as if the light struggled to spread. As they crossed the garden, Helena had the impression that the entrance gate, which had never seemed closed, was now partially obscured by branches lower than she remembered. She didn't comment. She simply followed. The walk to the main road was too short. Helena noticed that Kaio kept a calculated pace, always slightly ahead, as if setting the rhythm. Whenever she slowed, he slowed too. Whenever she sped up, he adjusted his own steps. There was no confrontation, only forced synchrony. When they reached the point where the road forked, Helena stopped. She felt a sudden pressure in her head, a quick dizziness, as if her body rejected the idea of moving forward. She brought a hand to her temple, breathing deeply. Kaio immediately held her arm, firm but too careful to seem invasive. He said it might be better to go back, said she looked tired, said the house would be more comfortable. The word comfortable echoed inside her with strange weight. Helena tried to take one more step, just to test it. The dizziness intensified. The ground seemed to tilt subtly. It wasn't pain, it was resistance. As if something invisible were pushing her back with stubborn patience. She gave in. On the way back, Helena remained silent. So did Kaio. The house appeared again among the trees with unsettling speed, as if it had shortened the distance on its own. As they crossed the doorway, Helena felt the immediate relief of the pressure lifting, as if her body itself had been calibrated for that space. That frightened her more than any nighttime noise. That afternoon, Helena tried to call a friend. The call wouldn't go through. She tried again. Nothing. The screen showed unstable signal, then none at all. Helena walked to different points in the house, testing it. In some places, the phone seemed to react, vibrate lightly, as if about to connect. In others, it shut itself off. Kaio appeared at the bedroom door without her hearing him approach. He said the signal there had always been bad, said the house was in an old remote area, said the isolation was part of the charm. Helena nodded, putting the phone away. For the first time, she felt like crying without knowing exactly why. That night, while they ate dinner, Helena noticed something even more disturbing. Caio spoke about future plans, about adaptations to the house, about how certain changes required time. He constantly used the plural. We, here, always. Words that were slowly becoming structures. When Helena stood up to go to the bedroom, she noticed that one of the closed doors was now slightly ajar, just a crack. From inside came an old smell, stronger than the rest of the house, something between dust, stored fabric, and forgotten memory. She stopped in front of the door. Her heart raced. She felt an intense, almost painful curiosity, as if something inside was calling her by name. Before she could move, she heard Caio's voice behind her, low and firm. He said that room wasn't safe. He said it wasn't the right time. He said the house still didn't like sudden changes. Helena closed the door slowly, feeling a frustration she could no longer hide, even from herself. That night, as she lay down, she noticed something that finally gave fear a clear shape. The bedroom doorknob was now locked. She didn't remember locking it. She tried to turn it. It didn't open. Her breathing shortened. Her heart raced. Before panic could fully spread, the doorknob turned from the other side, unlocking itself with a soft click, almost reassuring. Helena stepped back, sitting on the bed, her hands trembling. The house wasn't just watching, it was responding. And in that silent instant, Helena understood that something essential had changed. Her desires were no longer being ignored. They were being corrected. And from that point on, every choice she tried to make would, in some way, be negotiated with the walls around her. After that night, Helena began to perceive the house no longer as a space, but as an active presence. Not something that moved in any visible way, nor something that imposed itself through open violence, but something that learned. Every reaction of hers seemed to be recorded, assessed, and then answered with almost surgical precision. The routine became stricter without ever being declared a rule. Coffee was always ready at the same hour. Meals happened before Helena even felt hungry. The outdoor lights turned off on their own when the sun began to dip. The windows were closed by Caio with excessive care, like someone sealing something precious. Everything was done delicately, in the language of devotion, and that made it harder to resist. Helena began to feel guilty for wanting to leave, guilty for thinking of places where Caio wasn't, guilty for imagining a life that didn't include those walls. It was a soft guilt, almost polite, but constant. The house didn't punish her for those thoughts. It simply reminded her, through small physical discomforts, that this was where her body seemed to function best. Whenever she insisted on going to the gate, a sudden fatigue would hit. Whenever she thought about taking the car, a headache would appear without warning. And whenever she gave up, everything adjusted again. The air grew lighter, her heart slowed down, the world made sense again. Caio noticed these shifts and interpreted them as signs of successful care. He became even more present, even more attentive. His touch grew more frequent, more lingering, as if he needed to reaffirm something that kept slipping away. There was love, yes, but there was also a silent need for confirmation. On a rainy afternoon, while the sound of water striking the roof created an almost hypnotic isolation, Caio led Helena to a small room she hadn't seen yet. It wasn't in the forbidden hallway, but in a side wing of the house, too discreet to draw attention. It was a small room, almost intimate, with a single high, narrow window. Inside, there was an old dresser, a chair, and an oval mirror hanging on the wall. The mirror's frame was darkened by time, and the glass was slightly wavy, subtly distorting the reflection. Caio said it was a special space, a place where the house tended to keep what mattered. Helena felt an immediate shiver, but she didn't step back. She approached the mirror and faced her own reflection. For a brief second, too fast to ignore, too slow to be imagination, Helena didn't recognize herself. The reflection looked slightly different, paler, more tired, as if it had lived there longer than she actually had. She blinked, and everything returned to normal. Caio watched in silence, with an expression that mixed anticipation and unease. He stepped closer and set something on the dresser, a simple necklace of dark metal, with a small opaque stone at its center. The object didn't shine. It absorbed the light around it. He said it was an old symbol of the house. He said it had always been worn by those who needed protection. He said that with it, Helena would feel better, more stable. Helena hesitated. The necklace triggered a visceral reaction in her, hard to justify. It wasn't repulsion, but recognition, like something in her knew exactly what that object meant, even if she couldn't understand why. Caio didn't press with words. He simply held the necklace carefully, waiting. The house felt too silent in that moment, as if everything were suspended, awaiting a decision. Helena thought about the constant fatigue, about the dizziness when she tried to leave, about the immediate relief whenever she agreed to stay, about the love she had found there. crooked perhaps, but present, about the fear of losing it all without knowing whether she could rebuild anything like it outside. She let him. Caio clasped the necklace around her neck, closing the latch with a soft final click. The instant the metal touched her skin, Helena felt a slight tightening in her chest, followed by a wave of warmth that spread slowly. It wasn't pain, it was accommodation. The mirror seemed to shiver for a second. Helena took a deep breath and realized, surprised, that the exhaustion had eased. Her head felt light, her body calm. It was as if something had finally clicked into place. Caio smiled, relieved. That night, Helena slept deeply. No dreams, no interruptions. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't wake in the middle of the night. The silence didn't feel watchful. It felt satisfied. But when she woke, Helena noticed something that made her heart sink, slowly. She couldn't clearly remember why exactly. She had wanted so badly to leave the house in the days before. The urge felt distant, unreal, almost childish. She touched the necklace instinctively. And in that automatic gesture, the house understood something essential. Helena was no longer just staying there. She had agreed to remain. And so, with a simple object and a seemingly small decision, Act 1 came to an end. Not with a visible prison, but with a silent agreement that would change everything from that moment on. The calm that settled in after the necklace wasn't immediate like a miracle, nor abrupt like an imposition. It came in layers, discreet and almost polite, as if the house knew Helena needed to believe that peace was a choice, not a consequence. The days began to flow with a deceptive smoothness. Her body seemed to work better there. She slept more, thought less, felt less. And that, by itself, began to unsettle her. Helena realized that her memories of the world outside the house were becoming vague. They didn't vanish completely, but they lost sharpness, like old photographs left in the light too long. Friends' faces surfaced without details. Familiar streets blended together. Even the exact reason she had accepted Caio's invitation began to dissolve into a generic sensation of past exhaustion. The house didn't steal memories by force. It simply made them unnecessary. Caio seemed lighter since Helena accepted the necklace. His shoulders relaxed. His gaze lost that constant vigilance she was only now able to recognize clearly. He spoke of the future more naturally, as if certain uncertainties had finally been resolved. He touched Helena with more confidence, like someone who no longer feared losing her. There was love there. Helena couldn't deny it. A real love, imperfect, deeply human. But now she began to notice something that had once slipped past her. Caio's love seemed conditioned by the house's balance. Whenever Helena grew restless, he tensed. Whenever she settled, he bloomed. It was as if he too was being regulated. One morning, Helena decided to rearrange the bedroom, a simple, almost domestic impulse. She moved the bed a few inches, opened drawers she hadn't explored yet, touched objects that seemed to have been placed there a long time ago. When she opened the last drawer in the dresser, she found something unexpected, a small notebook with a dark cover, hidden beneath a false bottom. The notebook wasn't dusty. The pages were old, yellowed, filled with firm, feminine handwriting. Helena flipped through carefully, her heart speeding up as she recognized patterns. The first pages spoke of arriving, of exhaustion, of gratitude for finally finding silence. They spoke of an attentive, protective man who seemed to understand old pain without demanding explanations. The words were dangerously familiar. As she continued, the tone shifted. Discreet doubts appeared, questions left unanswered, observations about closed doors, about the necklace, about the strange relief that came when she gave up on leaving. The author wrote like someone trying to convince herself everything was still under control. In the last pages, the handwriting grew uneven. "I don't know anymore if I want to leave," one passage said. "I don't know anymore if I can," said another. And then a sentence underlined with enough force to nearly tear the paper. "When I realized I didn't miss anything except the house, I understood something had been taken from me." Helena closed the notebook with trembling hands. The house remained silent, no creak, no immediate reaction, as if it were watching the effect of that discovery before deciding its next move. That night, Helena had a different dream. There were no endless corridors, no closed doors. She dreamed she walked through the empty house, calling for Caio, but no sound came out. When she touched the walls, she felt something pulsing beneath the surface, like slow veins. At the center of the house, she found the necklace lying alone on the floor, split in two. When she woke, the necklace was still intact around her neck, but the tightness in her chest was real. Helena spent the day in silence watching. She noticed certain doors were harder to open than before. She noticed the living room clock seemed to run slow whenever she was alone, and she noticed, with ice along her spine, that Caio had begun to avoid a specific hallway upstairs, the same one where the door that had never been opened was located. That afternoon, while Kaya was out, Helena tried something she hadn't done in days. She grabbed her coat and walked to the front door without saying anything. When she touched the doorknob, she felt immediate pressure in her chest, stronger than before. The necklace warmed. Her vision dimmed for a second. She let go of the knob, panting. The pressure stopped almost instantly. Helena rested her forehead against the closed door, tears rising not from fear but from painful recognition. The house didn't need to correct her with subtlety anymore. Now it had a direct link, an access point, and in that moment, Helena understood something essential and terrible. The calm she felt wasn't the absence of conflict, it was anesthesia, and like all anesthesia, it required higher and higher doses. After the failed attempt to leave, Helena began to measure every movement with a new caution. It wasn't only fear, it was strategy. Something inside her had awakened, even under the thick layer of artificial tranquility, a core of lucidity that resisted, however tired. She began to observe the house the way one observes an organism, looking for patterns, reactions, sensitive points. She realized the house didn't like haste, didn't like abrupt decisions, and above all, didn't like being ignored. When Helena spent long stretches in absolute silence, sitting without moving, the house reacted with small sounds, a distant creak, a dry snap, the clock resuming its ticking, as if it wanted to remind her it was there, that it still needed her. But when Helena stayed busy, absorbed in repetitive tasks, organizing, cleaning, tending, everything remained calm. Care soothed the house. That realization disturbed her deeply. Kyle seemed more and more integrated into the place's rhythm. There was a resigned serenity in him, like someone who no longer fought the current. He spoke little about himself, but a great deal about the house, necessary repairs, old stories, small daily rituals that helped everything work better. Helena listened with practiced attention, while inside she cataloged every detail. One quiet afternoon, while she was organizing the living room bookcase, a task no one had asked for, but that had risen in her like an almost automatic impulse, Helena found something hidden behind a row of thick books, a yellowed envelope, unnamed, sealed only by an old fold. Inside there were letters written in different hands, in different eras, each beginning almost the same way, accounts of arrival, relief, gratitude for finally finding a place where the world felt far away. A chill ran down Helena's spine as she recognized sentences that could have been hers. As she read on, the letters became more fragmented. Some mentioned recurring dreams, others spoke of physical pain when trying to leave. Many mentioned the necklace, few mentioned the man always, described as good, attentive, someone who did what had to be done. One letter, written in tiny, steady handwriting, caught her eye. The author described the house as something that learns love through repetition, and said that at a certain point she realized it was no longer the house that needed her. It was she who needed the house in order to know who she was. The last line was smeared, as if written through tears. When I tried to remember who I was before, I found nothing but walls. Helena closed her eyes, feeling a tightness in her chest that didn't come from the necklace, but from something deeper. She wasn't just a potential prisoner. She was part of a succession, a silent continuity of women who had mistaken shelter for identity. That night, Helena heard something different. Not footsteps, not creaks, voices, low, nearly imperceptible, as if they were coming from inside the walls. Not clear words, but murmurs, fragments of intent, emotions without a defined shape. Helena sat up in bed, her heart racing, trying to decide whether it was a dream, a memory, or something new. The voices weren't calling for her. They were calling for the house. There was a mixture of resignation and attachment in them, as if they were speaking of a place loved too much to be left. Tears slipped down Helena's face in silence. For the first time, she understood what truly remained there after people disappeared. Not bodies, bonds. The next morning, Helena looked at Kaya with different eyes. She noticed the old tiredness in his face, hidden beneath calm. She noticed how he avoided mirrors. She noticed how he seemed relieved when Helena followed the routine without questioning, as if every one of her gestures reinforced something that kept him whole. She decided to speak, not to confront, but to test. In a casual tone, she mentioned that she'd heard voices at night. Kaya froze for an imperceptible second, too quick for anyone not watching closely. Then he smiled, saying the house made strange noises, the wind, the old wood, but his eyes gave away something deeper. Helena understood then that Kaya knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not from the start, but enough to fear any crack in that balance. That afternoon, Helena went upstairs alone. The forbidden corridor felt longer, narrower, The door at the end remained shut, unmoving, as if it had never been touched. The necklace warmed as she approached, but there was no immediate pain, only warning. She placed her hand on the wood. She felt something pulsing on the other side, not like a threat, like waiting. Helena withdrew her hand slowly, her heart pounding. It still wasn't the moment, but now she knew there was a center, a place where everything converged, a point in the house that wasn't merely structure but condensed memory. And that center held not only the origin of the prison, but the key to breaking it. After touching that door, Helena was no longer the same. Something shifted inside her, not explosively but like an axis moving slightly, altering the balance of everything around it. The house noticed. Kaio noticed. And though no one said anything, the silence began to carry a new expectation, almost tense. Helena started to notice that Kaio avoided leaving her alone for long stretches. It wasn't explicit surveillance. It was strategic presence. He always appeared with some task, some need, some act of care. He offered companionship like protection, but Helena could no longer ignore the subtext. Keeping the bond active was essential for everything to keep working. She began to observe Kaio not just as a man, but as part of the system. She realized he never crossed the forbidden corridor, never touched that door. His steps always seemed to skirt that specific point in the house, as if there were a silent agreement between him and the walls. She also noticed moments when Kaio seemed to struggle against something invisible, brief pauses, deeper breaths, exhaustion that came out of nowhere. One night, Helena woke with a strange sensation in her chest. It wasn't pain, it was pressure, as if something were being slowly pulled into her. She sat up, touching the necklace, and felt an impulse that didn't come from the house, but from herself. She needed to understand what happened to Kaio while she slept. She got up without turning on the light and opened the bedroom door carefully. The hallway was dark, but not completely. A diffuse glow seemed to rise from below, from the central room. Helena walked slowly, feeling the floor respond beneath her steps with an almost imperceptible vibration. At the top of the stairs, she saw Kaio. He stood in the center of the room, motionless, facing the cold fireplace. His eyes were open, but empty, his body rigid, as if it were being held upright by something beyond himself. A deep chill ran through Helena. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid for him. The house felt denser in that moment. The air pressed on her lungs. The clock showed an impossible time. Hands stopped in positions that corresponded to no hour at all. Helena realized then that Kaio wasn't awake. He was being used, not like a puppet, but like an anchor, a point of stability that kept the house organized while something deeper moved. A bitter understanding took shape in her mind. Kaio wasn't the jailer. He was the unwilling guardian, kept there by the same promise of protection that was now closing around her. When Helena took a step forward, the necklace heated sharply. The pressure in her chest intensified. The house reacted to her movement, not with aggression, but with maximum alert. She stopped, gasping, and in that instant Kaio blinked, as if waking. His eyes met hers, and for a second there was panic. Not the panic of someone caught, but the panic of someone who knows something essential is about to collapse. He moved to her quickly, gripping her shoulders firmly, almost pleading for her to go back to the bedroom. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. In his touch, Helena felt the weight of someone carrying a role too old to be questioned without consequences. For the first time, she was absolutely sure Kaio had never chosen that part consciously. He had been led, molded, adjusted over time, until he no longer knew how to exist outside of it. The next day, Helena found something new in her room. On the nightstand lay a small object that hadn't been there before, an old key, darkened with age, engraved with a symbol she recognized immediately. It was the same symbol that repeated in the old paintings, in the diaries, in the half-erased details of the house, the symbol of the center. Helena didn't need to test it. She knew exactly which door that key belonged to. The necklace warmed continuously, not like pain but like sustained warning. The house didn't want her to use that key, but it also hadn't hidden it. That frightened her more than a direct prohibition. The house was allowing it. Helena understood then the role beginning to take shape for her, a role none of the women before her seemed to have reached. She hadn't been chosen just to stay. She had been chosen to replace Kaio, to maintain the bond, keep the house alive, become the new point of balance between love, care, and captivity, not as a prisoner, but as a guardian. The thought made her stomach turn. Helena gripped the key tightly, feeling its symbolic weight travel through her whole body. The house remained too silent, as if waiting for the final decision before revealing everything. Helena looked toward the forbidden corridor, toward the door that had never been opened, and she knew Act 2 was nearing its most dangerous point, because now running wasn't the only option. The real choice would be between breaking the cycle, or taking the place the house had been preparing for her since her very first step beyond the threshold. And in that quiet morning, Helena understood that the hardest love wasn't the one that held her, but the one that would demand she destroy everything that promised to protect her. Helena moved through that day like someone walking along the edge of an invisible cliff. Nothing around her looked different at first glance, but everything carried a silent tension, as if the house had tuned its attention exclusively to her. The air felt thicker, the corridors shorter, the sounds closer. The mansion didn't need to watch anymore, now it waited. The key stayed in Helena's pocket like a weight that wouldn't let her forget. Every step she took seemed to echo the question she kept refusing to answer: use it or not, open it or keep pretending the mystery could be skirted. The house didn't rush her. It knew, as it always had, that fear ripens best when given time. Kaio, meanwhile, seemed exhausted. Not a normal physical tiredness, but something that accumulated in his shoulders, in his gaze, in the way he took a breath before speaking. Helena realized that the closer she moved to the center of the truth, the more fragile Kaio became. It was as if the house were redistributing strength, preparing a transition that still hadn't been officially accepted. Late that afternoon, Helena found Kaio sitting in the smaller living room, the one where the fireplace was rarely lit. He stared at the cold hearth as if expecting something to appear there. When Helena approached, he lifted his eyes with an expression that mixed relief and dread. He spoke, not in long explanations or complete answers, but in fragments. He said the house had always chosen someone to remain, someone who learned its rhythms, accepted its limits, confused care with belonging. He said that at first the house offered shelter, then it demanded constancy. Finally, it asked for continuity. Kaio admitted he hadn't been the first, and he wouldn't be the last if the cycle continued. He spoke of how he had tried to resist at the beginning, how he had believed he could love someone there without delivering her to the same fate. But the house didn't accept temporary visitors, only permanences. Helena listened in silence, feeling every word slot with painful precision into the gaps she had already sensed. There was no direct villainy in Kaio. There was fear. There was dependence. There was someone who had learned to survive by giving himself up, little by little. When Helena asked about the door at the end of the forbidden corridor, Kaio closed his eyes. He said that space held what remained of all the previous bonds, not bodies, not ghosts in the usual sense, but condensed memories, unfinished intentions, promises that never found the courage to be undone. He said the house needed that core to exist as it did, that without it the mansion would be nothing but empty walls. And then came the revelation that changed everything. Kaio said the house couldn't force anyone to take the center. It needed consent. It always had. The necklace, the sensations, the small obstacles, those were only preparation. The real agreement was sealed only when someone crossed that door of their own free will. The key in Helena's pocket suddenly felt twice as heavy. Helena understood then the scale of the trap. The house wouldn't force her. It didn't have to. It was enough that she believed staying was better than facing the world without that shelter. It was enough that her love for Kaio was large enough to justify a silent sacrifice. The house didn't feed on bodies. It fed on choices. That night, Helena didn't sleep. She walked the dark hallways, feeling the mansion pulse in an irregular rhythm. The voices in the walls were clearer now. They didn't speak words, but raw emotions, fear of abandonment, hunger for permanence, the illusory peace of never having to decide anything again. She stopped in front of the forbidden door. The key felt hot in her hand. Helena thought about everything she had lost before she arrived. She thought about the exhaustion that had brought her here. She thought about the love she had found in Kaio, real and painfully insufficient to save him. She thought about the anesthetic calm the house offered and how easy it would be to accept it. For one brief, dangerous moment, Helena almost gave in. She almost believed that staying, taking the center, keeping everything running, would be a greater form of love, a noble sacrifice, an inevitable destiny. But then she thought of something none of the women before her seemed to have done. She thought of herself as someone who still existed outside the house. Helena closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and slipped the key back into her pocket. Not yet. The house reacted with a slight shudder, like a frustrated organism. Not in anger, impatience. The living room clock began turning its hands backward. Distant doors slammed. The air grew heavy. The turning point was sealed. From that moment on, Helena was no longer a candidate. She was a threat, and the house finally would stop merely seducing and begin defending its own existence. The change was immediate, though almost imperceptible at first. Helena felt it in her body before she saw it in the environment. The air lost its deceptive softness, turning drier, rougher. Breathing required attention. Each inhale felt like it had to pass through a space that no longer wanted to accommodate her easily. The house was afraid, not human fear, panic or confusion, but a structural, primitive fear, like something realizing the real possibility of ceasing to exist the way it always had. Helena understood it with frightening clarity. As long as she seemed replaceable, the house had been patient. Now that it sensed refusal, it had to react. Kaio began to fall ill, not suddenly, but progressively. His skin lost color, his gaze dulled. He seemed tired even after long stretches of rest. Helena realized that the more she resisted the house, the more fragile he became, as if the energy that had once been shared was being yanked from him by force, trying to keep her under control. The realization was cruel. Helena found herself facing an emotionally devastating calculus. Every step toward freedom seemed to push Kaio closer to collapse. The house didn't need to threaten directly. It only had to demonstrate the consequences. The corridors began to shift in subtle ways. Paths Helena knew grew longer. Doors appeared where none had been before. The living room clock started showing impossible times, sometimes racing forward, sometimes sliding back, as if time no longer felt obligated to be linear inside those walls. At night, the dreams returned with violence. Helena dreamed she was seated at the center of the house, occupying the place that had been offered to her, while Kaio walked freely out, healed, light, whole. The house watched in satisfied silence. When Helena woke, she felt guilty before she even opened her eyes. The house had learned to negotiate. One early morning, Helena woke to a deep sound from upstairs. Not a creak, but something like a sigh held too long. She got up and followed it, even as the necklace tightened like a constant reminder of the bond it was still trying to reactivate. The forbidden corridor was different. The walls felt closer, and the door at the end pulsed faintly, as if it were breathing. Helena felt an almost irresistible urge to use the key, not to surrender, but to understand. Now the danger wasn't only staying, it was allowing the house to keep existing in that form. She touched the doorknob. The contact brought intense images. Women seated at the center, repeating gestures they didn't remember choosing. Exhausted men tending the house like a wound that never closed. Years piling up without progress, only permanence. Helena jerked her hand back, heart hammering. She understood then the final layer of captivity. The house didn't destroy whoever stayed. It simply prevented any story from ever moving forward. The next morning, Helena found Kaio sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. When she came closer, he smiled, weakly. With effort, he said maybe it would be better if she accepted. He said the house needed someone strong. He said he was too tired to keep holding it up. Something broke inside Helena. It wasn't fear anymore. It was lucid anger. She saw that the house didn't offer protection. It offered postponement. It postponed pain, grief, growth, change. It turned everything into an endless waiting room, and that finally became unacceptable. Helena decided she wouldn't run again. This time, she would go all the way into the house, not to take the center, but to empty it. She climbed to the second floor with steady steps, ignoring the pressure in her chest, ignoring the necklace burning against her skin. The house reacted with harsher sounds, doors slamming, walls cracking. It wasn't fury, it was desperation. In front of the forbidden door, Helena paused for only an instant. She thought of who she had been before she came. She thought of who she would become if she stayed. She thought of Kaio, not as someone to be saved at her own expense, but as someone who, like her, needed to be freed from the lie of eternal shelter. She turned the key. The door opened with a deep, ancient sound, like something snapping after decades of restraint. And as she crossed that threshold, Helena knew she wasn't facing the house anymore. She was facing everything that happens when the fear of leaving disguises itself as love. When Helena stepped through, the world lost its familiar edges. There was no complete darkness, no revealing light. What wrapped around her was a profound neutrality, a space where nothing seemed to begin or end. The air didn't circulate there, it hung suspended, as if held in place by sheer insistence. The center of the house wasn't a room in the usual sense. It was a structured emptiness. The space was circular, wide, with walls that looked like layered strata of memory. There were no windows, no furniture, only marks on the floor, grooves, faded shapes, signs that something had been there for a long time. Helena felt its weight immediately. Not a physical weight, but an existential one, like that place had been built to hold decisions that were never made. At the exact center of the circle, there was a shallow dip in the floor, a point where the wood sank a few centimeters, as if someone had stayed there too long, pressing down on the same spot over and over. Helena recognized it with painful clarity. That was where those who accepted would sit. The house manifested then, not with a voice, not with a defined image, but with a presence that filled the entire space. It felt like standing before pure intention, stripped of human form. Helena sensed thoughts that weren't hers crossing her mind, promises of eternal rest, of no choices, of absolute silence. The house didn't ask for obedience. It asked for continuity. Helena understood the final secret. The house wasn't alive in the usual way. It existed because someone had always been willing not to leave. Each person who accepted the center left behind their ability to desire anything beyond those walls. The house didn't kill. It didn't imprison by force. It simply offered a place where nothing had to change, and for many that was enough. The necklace began to heat violently, as if trying to reform. to seize control again. Helena reached up and yanked hard. The metal resisted for 1 second too long, then gave way, snapping with a dry crack that echoed throughout the space. The house reacted. The walls vibrated. The air compressed. The marks on the floor began to blur, as if being erased by force. Helena felt crushing pressure in her chest, but she didn't step back. She didn't need to destroy the house physically. She needed to remove what kept it functioning. She walked toward the center. Each step felt like defying decades of permanence. Helena felt other people's memories move through her, not as complete visions, but as raw emotions, fear of starting over, relief in giving up, guilt softened by routine. She absorbed it all without resisting, not as captivity, but as witness. And then she did something no one before her had done. Helena did not sit. Instead, she knelt only long enough to place her open hand on the center and, with calm clarity, leave something the house had never learned how to process, a conscious goodbye. She thought of leaving, not fleeing, not being expelled, but walking out knowing exactly what she was leaving behind, without denying it, without romanticizing it, without promising to return. The house collapsed inward. There was no mechanism to handle that. Everything there had been built for unconscious permanence, not lucid closure. The emptiness began to expand, not destroying but deactivating. The walls lost density. The air began to truly circulate for the first time. Helena felt her body grow light, not from anesthesia, but from reclaiming herself. The center stopped being a point of containment and became simply floor. When Helena stood, the space no longer demanded presence. Downstairs, Kaio felt it immediately. The weight holding him there gave way at once, like a rope snapping after years of tension. He dropped to his knees in the kitchen, struggling to breathe, not from pain, but from return. Something inside him, suspended too long, slid back into place. The house began to quiet, not in attentive silence, but in neutral silence. Doors stopped closing on their own. The living room clock stopped, not from failure, but from irrelevance. Time no longer needed to be contained. Helena walked out of the center with steady steps, feeling that nothing was trying to hold her back. The house didn't fight anymore. It couldn't. Its core had been emptied of the only thing that sustained it, the promise that staying was better than going on. When Helena crossed the corridor again and went down the stairs, she found Kaio sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his face marked by a deep but human exhaustion. When he saw her, he cried, not from fear, not from loss, from something close to release. They didn't need to say anything. The house, now only a house, stood still around them. And in that moment, Helena understood that the climax hadn't been destroying the place. It had been proving that no shelter has the right to demand that someone stop existing in order to remain safe. Leaving wasn't rushed. There was no running, no dramatic urgency. Helena moved through the corridors with deliberate steps, feeling every inch of the space now quiet in a different way. Not the watchful silence that cages, but the ordinary silence of something that has stopped demanding. The walls were still there, firm and old, but stripped of the expectation that once made them heavy. The house was empty, not empty of furniture or history, but empty of intent, and that made all the difference. Kaio followed a few paces behind, still adjusting to his own body, his own breathing. He seemed smaller, more human, like someone who had finally returned to carrying only his own weight. There were no promises between them, no need for explanations. Both understood, in different ways, that the place had shaped their lives, and that now it was up to each of them to decide what to do with what was left. When they crossed the front door, late afternoon light wrapped around them without resistance. Wind moved through the garden, stirring the trees that now looked like trees, not centuries. Helena drew a deep breath, feeling air fill her lungs without opposition, without cost, without adjustment. She didn't look back right away. She had learned that some places must be left without a final witness, so they can't regain strength through nostalgia. Still, before she walked away completely, she turned one last time. The house remained solid, silent, motionless. It didn't look wounded. It didn't look furious. It looked simply finished. Helena felt a gentle, inevitable sadness, because not every prison is built from hatred. Some are built from misdirected care, shared fear, love that never learned to allow departure. The house had been all of that, and for that very reason it had to end there. Kaio took a different path on the road, not out of distance, but necessity. He needed to learn how to exist outside the role he had played for so long. Helena watched him go with a mix of compassion and acceptance. Some stories don't continue together, they just stop hurting at the same time. Alone, Helena walked to where the car was parked. When she got in, she felt something unexpected, not the euphoria of freedom, but its responsibility. There were no walls left to decide for her, no silence to numb her choices. The world now demanded full presence. She started the engine, As she drove away, she realized she didn't want to forget what she'd lived. She didn't want to erase the house from memory. Because she understood something essential. The prison doesn't begin when the door closes. It begins when we stop asking whether we're still ourselves inside. The road opened ahead, long, imperfect, alive, and Helena kept going, not protected, not contained, but whole, knowing that from then on, whenever a place promised absolute shelter, she would remember that house, and the truth she learned late, but not too late. Love that demands permanence is not refuge, it's fear disguised as home. And so the story didn't end with an empty house, but with someone who learned to leave carrying her own voice with her. Time didn't pass immediately inside the house, not because it was suspended, but because there was no one left to measure it. Without an active center, without someone to absorb permanence, days stopped piling up. Light entered through the windows without being filtered by intention. Wind moved through the corridors without meeting resistance. Dust began to settle honestly, without being rearranged, without being wiped away by obedient hands. The house didn't die. It simply stopped insisting. The clocks stayed frozen. Not broken, just useless. The doors stayed open long enough for outside air to become part of the inside. The sound of the distant road reached the main room on certain days, a reminder that the world kept existing without needing to be contained. The marks on the floor where the old center had been didn't vanish completely. They remained like architectural scars, soft enough not to frighten, deep enough not to ignore. They weren't signs of error. They were records of permanences that lasted too long. If someone entered now, they wouldn't feel vertigo, they wouldn't feel immediate comfort, they would feel only the ordinary weight of an old place, heavy with stories that would not repeat. The house had lost its main function, to hold, and that made it harmless. Some nights, when the moon hit at a particular angle, shadows still fell strangely across the walls, not as presences, but as visual echoes of something that no longer had the strength to form again. There were no voices, no calls, only inert memory. The house had never learned to love, it had only learned to keep, and deprived of that, it became only a space, what it should have been from the beginning. Maybe someday, far in the future, someone would pass by, glance at the old facade, feel curious and move on without going in. Maybe someone else would enter, spend a few hours and leave without feeling anything beyond a faint discomfort they couldn't explain. And that would be enough, because the house no longer needed witnesses. It existed now only as a physical reminder of what happens when the fear of being alone is stronger than the desire to move forward. And for the first time since it was built, the house finally respected those who passed by. The silence now wasn't vigilance, it was consequence. Helena took a long time to realize she had changed, not because the transformation was small, but because it was quiet. She kept living, working, walking ordinary streets, keeping schedules, moving through days that, from the outside, held nothing extraordinary. The world didn't demand explanations, and in a way that was a relief. But something in her no longer fit the way it used to. Helena began to experience places differently, not just houses but entire environments, restaurants, offices, rented rooms, crowded spaces. In all of them she carried a new kind of attention, a sharpened sensitivity to what wasn't said, to the weight of silence, to the subtle difference between being welcomed and being absorbed. She didn't feel comfortable in places where everything seemed too perfect, where there was no noise at all, where no one ever seemed eager to leave. Those spaces made her restless, not from fear but from recognition. Her body had learned to react before her mind did. Some nights Helena woke with the memory of the house, not as a nightmare but as a gentle warning. There were no clear images, no voices, only the sensation that something had almost been taken from her, and that now it needed to be protected carefully. She became someone who didn't accept permanence without questions. She didn't accept love that asked for less world. She didn't accept promises that came packaged with isolation. She didn't accept comfort that demanded forgetting. Sometimes that made her lonelier, but it also made her more whole. There were days Helena missed Kaio, not the man shaped by the house, but the one who might have existed before it. In quiet moments, she wondered whether he had managed to build something outside that role. She didn't seek answers. She understood that some stories need to remain open so they don't become another kind of cage. Helena learned to leave without dramatizing. Whenever something began to close too tightly around her, a relationship, a job, a routine, she stepped back before the relief of stagnation could become tempting. She wasn't fleeing. She was continuing. And there was inside her a calm certainty that never left her again. True love does not shrink the world, it expands it. She didn't talk about the house, not out of shame or fear, but because she knew some experiences don't need to be shared to stay real. The lesson remained active in her, showing up in small, almost invisible choices, decisive all the same. Helena did not become immune to pain, nor to exhaustion, nor to the desire for rest. But now she knew how to tell rest from surrender, and that, although it didn't make her invincible, made her free enough to continue. Because some exits don't return us to where we began, they shift us to a place where we can never again accept anything less than existing fully. There was one detail Helena didn't notice when she left, not because it was hidden, nor because it was insignificant, but because some things only reveal themselves once they no longer have the power to hurt. They remain at the edges of memory, waiting for the moment when they can be seen without distortion. Months later, on a morning too ordinary to be memorable, Helena found something while organizing, a forgotten box at the back of her closet. Among old papers, useless receipts, and objects that had survived moves without any clear purpose, there was a small fragment of darkened metal, the clasp of the necklace. Not the whole necklace, just the broken end, irregular, as if it had been torn away at the exact moment of rupture. Helena held the object between her fingers with calm curiosity. There was no dizziness, no pressure in her chest, only distant recognition. The metal was cold, cold like any inert object, and that by itself confirmed something she already knew, but had never clearly articulated. The house had not followed her. The bond had truly ended. What remained was only material memory, without intention, without hunger, without a will of its own. Still, Helena carried the fragment to the window. She watched the light reflect unevenly on its worn surface. She thought about how many people had touched that object before her, how many had confused relief with belonging, how many had agreed to stay not because they wanted to, but because they were too tired to leave. Helena felt no anger, no pity. She felt responsibility. In that moment, she understood that some stories don't end when we leave them. They continue to exist as silent warnings, as internal tools of perception. The house, as a physical place, had lost its power, but the idea behind it, the temptation to surrender to comfort that erases, would keep appearing in other forms, in other contexts, under other names. Helena closed her hand around the fragment and made a simple decision. She didn't throw it away. She didn't hide it. She kept it in a visible place, not as a traumatic souvenir, but as a marker, a concrete reminder that what traps us rarely presents itself as a prison. Most often it presents itself as care. Somewhere far away, the old house remained silent. It did not call. It did not wait. But it had not been destroyed either, because places like that don't need to exist physically to fulfill their function. They survive as concepts, as possible choices, as seductive shortcuts in moments of deep exhaustion. The difference now was this. Helena knew how to recognize the invitation, and whenever the world felt too heavy, whenever the desire to stop disguised itself as the desire to stay, she remembered, not the house, but the exact moment she chose to leave knowingly, not to flee, not to be saved, simply to leave whole. Because the real danger had never been the walls that close in, but the part of us that, in silence, begins to feel grateful when they do. Years later, on a day too ordinary to arouse suspicion, someone slowed down while driving along the narrow road that cut through that forgotten stretch of map. There were no signs, no tourist markers, only ancient trees bent by time and a building partially visible through the branches. The house, it didn't draw attention through grandeur. It drew it through the involuntary pause it caused. The driver, someone exhausted by a life too full of noise, postponed decisions, and promises that never came true, felt the impulse to stop. They couldn't explain why. They simply pulled over and turned off the engine. The silence was immediate. Not the dense silence of before, but a neutral, almost polite silence, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own breathing without interference. The wind moved through the leaves, and the sound was just that, wind, no expectation embedded, no invisible correction. The person walked a few steps toward the house. They observed the old facade, the tall windows, the wood darkened by time. There was something there that suggested history, but not invitation. There was no immediate sense of shelter, no promise, only the ordinary presence of a place that had once been important to someone, at some time for reasons that no longer mattered. The gate, once almost symbolic, stood open. The person entered the grounds, walking slowly, feeling the uneven earth beneath their feet. They approached the front door, hesitated for a moment, then touched the wood with their fingertips. Nothing happened. No reaction, no adjustment, no recognition. The house did not respond, and that was strange in a new way, because without realizing it, the person had expected something. A shiver, a sense of welcome, a tightness in the chest. But none of that came. Only the reflection of their own exhaustion projected onto walls that no longer knew what to do with it. The person turned around, not out of fear, not out of rejection, but out of sudden disinterest. The house offered nothing beyond what it was, an old place empty of intention. And without intention there was no possible exchange. What had once functioned as a trap was now merely scenery. Returning to the car, the person felt something unexpected: relief. Not for leaving, but for not having been invited to stay. The world, with all its noise and imperfection, suddenly felt more honest than any promise of absolute silence. The engine started. The road stretched forward. Behind them, the house remained still, not waiting, not watching, just existing, like everything that has lost the ability to choose for someone else. And in that simple, definitive moment, something was silently confirmed in the fabric of time. The cycle does not repeat when no one accepts the role that keeps it alive. The house did not need to be destroyed. It only needed to be passed by someone who did not need it, because the true end of certain places doesn't happen when they collapse, but when they stop being necessary. Decades passed without anyone noticing exactly when it began. The world changed around the narrow road. New maps appeared, others vanished. The nearest town grew, shrank, changed names, and eventually became just another secondary point between faster routes. People came and went. Stories began and ended with the usual haste of those who don't realize they're repeating old patterns. The house remained. The roof lost a few tiles. The wood on the facade lightened in some places, darkened in others. The garden stopped being contained and began to grow irregularly, following only the rhythm of the seasons. The trees, now taller, cast shadows too long for any human memory to reach. Still, the structure endured, not by its own will, but because it had been well built. Those who passed by now felt nothing more than brief curiosity. Some stopped to take photographs, drawn by the place's aged atmosphere. Others didn't even slow down. For most, the house was just another building forgotten by time, perhaps worthy of restoration, perhaps of future demolition. Some people entered, occasional explorers, the curious, those searching for beautiful ruins. They walked the corridors, the ordinary steps, touched the walls without receiving any response, climbed stairs that creaked only because old wood always creaks. There were no doors closing on their own, no clocks frozen with meaning. Time there was simply time. Some reported a sense of melancholy, others a sense of emptiness. None reported a desire to stay. The former center of the house, now just a circular space with nearly erased marks on the floor, was seen as an architectural curiosity, a strange detail with no clear function. No visitor lingered there for more than a few minutes. There was nothing to sustain attention any longer, and that was final, because what had made that place dangerous was never its shape, its structure, or even its accumulated history. It was the human need to surrender choices in exchange for relief. It was the fear of moving forward without guarantees. Decades later, that fear still existed in people, but it no longer found an echo there. The house had lost the one thing that made it special, the ability to present itself as an answer. Somewhere far away, Helena was no longer remembered by name. Her face wasn't in portraits, her story wasn't told, and that wasn't injustice. It was completion. She didn't need to be remembered for the effect of her choice to remain active, because what she left behind wasn't absence. It was interruption, the rarest kind of legacy. And so, as the years passed, the house became only what it should always have been, a neutral space, incapable of promising more than temporary shelter, incapable of demanding permanence, incapable of confusing care with destiny. The wind continued to pass through the broken windows. The rain continued to fall on the worn roof. The sun continued to warm the marked ground, and none of it needed someone in order to continue. In the end, time did what it always does when no one tries to stop it. It moved on, because certain places only become dangerous when they believe someone needs them in order to exist.